First Meetings by Miss Winifred Quayle on AO3. Summary. The first time Pepper, Rhodey, and the Avengers meet Peter, each at different stages in Tony and Peter's relationship. Pepper. She was definitely curious about Peter Parker. There was something in Tony's eyes when he talked about the kid that Pepper didn't think she'd ever seen in Tony's eyes before. She'd had no idea what it was or what it meant, but it ignited her interest. Rhodey. He could pretend it was because he missed his friends, which wasn't a lie, but more than anything, Rhodey was hoping for a chance to, officially, meet Peter Parker. Tony had mentioned nonchalantly that he was looking out for a young superhero, but it was Pepper who spilled the full beans, the Avengers. Tony was different now, quieter, more settled, and Steve was sure there were more reasons behind the change than the diamond ring on Pepper's left hand. He just didn't know what. Chapter 1. Pepper. To put it lightly, Pepper had not been impressed to discover that Tony brought a 14-year-old vigilante into the mess that was Avengers' argument over the Scovia Accords. Especially once she'd heard the kid's family knew nothing of his alter ego. She hadn't agreed to Tony's decision post-Germany to distance himself from the kid and palm him off to Happy. Although there, she at least understood Tony's reasoning and fears. She didn't agree with them, but she understood them. Howard Stark had left deep marks on his son that weren't easy to get past, and recent events had left Tony with a lot on his plate and a lot of things to work through. She was definitely curious about Peter Parker. How could she not be? Not just because he was a teenager who liked to fight crime in his spare time, but there was something in Tony's eyes when he talked about the kid to Pepper that Pepper didn't think she'd ever seen in Tony's eyes before. She had no idea what it was or what it meant, but it ignited her interest. And when May Parker discovered the truth and demanded Tony take a more active role in keeping her nephew safe, consolation after the realization that she couldn't keep him from doing the Spider-Man thing, Tony agreed without hesitation. That did surprise Pepper a little, but she knew how awful Tony felt for taking away Peter's suit after the incident with the fairy, and could only assume he felt that this would make up for that, so Pepper hung back and watched Tony carefully, waiting and watching as Tony chose what this active role in Peter's life looked like, which apparently meant moving back to Manhattan and offering the kid weekly internship sessions with Tony in his personal lab in the tower. Pepper was hardly going to complain about the greater convenience of living in the city, although she did put her foot down and insist this was the last time they moved for a long time. Tony agreed to that easily. After a month, Pepper was curious enough to decide to work from home on a Wednesday, just so she'd be there when Peter was. Tony hadn't actually said much about his afternoons with Peter, but his silence was always the most telling where Tony was concerned. Tony either didn't notice what she was doing, or was just unfazed by it. Either way, he hadn't questioned her working from home that day, nor did he say anything when she approached him in the lab about some paperwork he hadn't signed, conveniently around the time Peter was due to arrive instead of literally any other time of the day. Tony made a face at the paperwork she handed him, as he always did, and claimed he'd get to it later. As he always did. Pepper played her usual role, too, fixing him with a stern stare, insisting that she needed this done sooner rather than later, because I'm trying to run a company here, Tony. Even as she stalled and waited for the lab doors to open. When there came a familiar hiss of the lab door sliding open, it wasn't so much the sound that made Pepper turn around, but the sight of Tony's mouth lifting into a warm, fond smile as his gaze moved to a spot behind her. "Hey, kid." Pepper's first thought upon seeing Peter Parker was that he somehow looked both older and younger than she'd expected. She had trouble imagining this lanky teen swinging around New York stopping crime. He was hovering uncertainly in the doorway, clutching the strap of a backpack where it was slung over his shoulder, no doubt surprised by Pepper's unexpected presence. Hi, Mr. Stark," the kid said, a little shyly. Am I interrupting?" "Nope," Tony said firmly, beckoning him forward. "Pepper is." "Oh." Pepper rolled her eyes at Peter, hesitantly approaching them. "Oh." Pepper rolled her eyes as Peter hesitantly approached them. As soon as he was close enough, Tony reached out and clasped a hand onto Peter's shoulder gently. "So, the two of you haven't actually met. Pep, this is Peter Parker." Tony introduced them with a gleam of what Pepper was sure was pride in his eyes. "Pete, meet Pepper." Pepper smiled at Peter, extending a hand towards him. "Hi, Peter. It's nice to finally meet you." "You too, Miss Potts," Peter said as he shook her hand. "My friend MJ, that is, Michelle, she thinks you're awesome." Pepper's smile widened and she chuckled slightly. "Well, that's good to hear. Thank you." She raised an eyebrow at Tony. "You hear that? I'm awesome." "Why do you act like that's news to me?" Tony demanded. "I hired you, remember? Technically twice. I'm not keeping you around just because you're pretty." "Not the sweetest thing you've ever said to me, but I'll take it," Pepper said dryly. Tony snorted, and Peter smiled faintly, although he looked rather awkward. Pepper took pity on him. You boys go do your thing," she ushered them away. "I'm just going to sit over here in the corner and do this paperwork. Tony keeps procrastinating." Tony shot her a sharp glance, eyes narrowing slightly. Pepper assumed he was annoyed at her repeated reminders about the paperwork, until Peter glanced at Tony hesitantly, his shoulders tensing. "If you're busy," he began, but Tony cut him off. "I'm only busy with you underoos," he said firmly. The way Peter's shoulders eased and his lips parted slightly in a silent breath of relief made Pepper's chest clench. It didn't seem to escape Tony's notice either, as he lightly squeezed the kid's shoulder. "Come over here and check this out." He gently prodded Peter over to the other side of the lab, taking his backpack from him and dropping it off onto the ground. "Ah, not you," he said to Dummy sternly, as the bot moved towards them with a bright chirp, extending his claw towards Peter. "You don't get Peter's attention today, not after this morning." Dummy's claw lowered with a sad chirp. "What happened this morning?" Peter asked immediately, his shoulders easing further. He tried to discreetly pet Dummy without Tony seeing as they passed within reach of Dummy. Tony saw it naturally, but he said nothing about it. He just launched into the story, although Pepper was sure he stifled a smile. Pepper settled herself onto the couch with the Stark pad and paperwork, but was admittedly more focused on Tony and Peter than her work. "Girl!" They were working on some part of the Spider-Man suit, from what Pepper could tell, and she let their conversation wash over her as they seamlessly switched between Tony patiently explaining something to Peter, who hung on Tony's every word, and Tony coaxing conversations out of Peter about school and his recent patrols. Peter either had forgotten about Pepper sitting there or just finally relaxed in her presence and chattered away happily to Tony. Okay, I gotta pause this real quick. I need to go talk to my friend. She was, like, really lost. And I felt really bad for her, so I didn't mind helping her get to Woodhaven, even though it was kind of out of the way. But it was really nice of her to give me the candy. Give me a sec. Okay, I'm back. Were you away from school the day they gave the lecture about accepting candy from strangers? Tony asked him. Peter grinned. I know the drill, Mr. Stark. Bit and binder, street smarts, and all that, he said dismissively, swiping at a part of the hologram that hung before them. Tony blinked at him nonplussed. I have no idea what any of that means, he said. Is that some Gen Z slang? Peter snorted faintly. No, he laughed. It's from John Mulaney's stand-up. The comedian? When Tony just stared at him without comprehension, Peter's eyes widened slightly. Oh my God, Mr. Stark. He's really funny. He used to be a writer on SNL. Why are you watching SNL? Tony demanded. You're 12. Peter rolled his eyes. 15. He corrected him. And I don't really watch it, he admitted, but, like, YouTube is a thing, you know? Uh-huh, was Tony's only reply, sounding rather amused. He does this whole bit on realizing that Back to the Future is a really weird movie when you think about it, and how someone had to go and pitch it to a studio. Like, they never explained how Doc and Marty became friends, you know? Tony paused, blinked, and then tilted his head thoughtfully. Huh. Peter went back to swiping at the hologram. Ned and I had this whole conversation about it when we saw it. I think Doc probably hired Marty for, like, an assistant job or something, and then he kind of stuck around, you know? Like, Marty was hired to clean the gutters or something, and then got interested in the science side of things, but Ned doesn't think it's believable that a scientist would let a kid hang around him just because. I don't know, I'd buy it. Some kids are like fungi. They grow on you and you can't get rid of them, Tony said, with a teasing grin at Peter, nudging him lightly in the side. Peter's face reddened, but his eyes brightened. What's Ned's theory, then? Tony asked. That Marty got stuck helping him through, like, community service or something. Like, he got in trouble at school and that was his punishment. And then they became friends. Tony snorted. Yes, I can imagine what a grueling punishment that would be. Pepper had given up any pretense of working, now just openly watching Peter and Tony, rather captivated by the scene before her. Peter, she said abruptly, getting to her feet and drawing both Peter and Tony's attention. She oddly felt close to tears as she smiled warmly at the teen. Would you like to stay for dinner? Peter's jaw dropped and his cheeks flushed slightly as his eyes immediately flickered towards Tony, his shoulders tensing again. Oh, he stammered awkwardly, fidgeting with a pencil lying on the desk. Tony looked almost as startled as Peter, but recovered much quicker, lightly nudging Peter in the side. Invitations to sample Pepper's famous chicken pot pie are rare, kid. Take it when you get it. Oh, dear God. I have not read out loud in, like, a while. He said lightly. Peter's cheeks grew redder, but he hesitantly nodded. Thank you, Miss Potts, he said shyly. Just Pepper is fine, Peter. Pepper chuckled. I'm gonna kill myself. Pepper chuckled. Tony snorted. Good luck with that, honey. Pepper stifled a laugh as Peter looked at Tony as though betrayed, who met his gaze innocently. What? Tony asked him. Peter's brow creased as he glared at Tony, which only made Tony grin. I'll see you upstairs for dinner, Pepper said, and left the lab. She returned to the penthouse, styling Happy, who usually dropped Peter home on Wednesday nights. Hey, Peter's going to stay for dinner, she greeted him once he answered. Happy paused for a beat, right, because I've got nothing better to do on a Wednesday night than wait around for the kid, he complained. Pepper rolled her eyes. I didn't say you had to wait, she reminded him. Feel free to head off if you want. Tony or I can drop him home once we've eaten. Happy paused again. Tony is gonna drop the kid home. He makes me schlep over to Queens and back to pick the kid up from school every week, but he'll drop him home. I'm quite happy to do it if Tony has an issue with it, Pepper said calmly, although she was pretty sure Tony wouldn't mind. All right, Happy said skeptically, but if Tony calls me complaining, good night, Happy. Pepper cut him off and ended the call. When Tony and Peter eventually joined her, Peter was either still stunned by the surprise dinner invitation or had newly stunned back into awkwardness by finding himself in the penthouse. Tony just ushered him over to the table, nudging him into a seat before moving to the kitchen to grab drinks for them all. I let Happy know Peter was staying, she told him. Tony nodded, grabbing 3 cans of soda. Pepper's hands stilled slightly. Usually they had a glass of wine over dinner, or maybe a beer, depending on what they were eating, but she said nothing. Tell him to head home, he said. I'll drop Underoos home after we eat. I'd hate for Happy to miss Survivor, he added, with a roll of his eyes. God knows I'd be hearing about that for the next week. Pepper couldn't swallow a smile. Already did. Peter did relax as they ate dinner, readily answering any questions Pepper asked him, although she wasn't sure if he relaxed because the questions were easy enough to answer or because Tony was quick to gently banter with the kid and put him at ease. Tony says your aunt is a nurse? Peter nodded. Yeah, at Mount Sinai in Queens. She works on the cancer ward. Pepper winced slightly. That must be hard. Peter nodded again. Yeah, he agreed. But she says that she likes it because she gets to really know the patients. She used to work in the ER, but it was always crazy. It's a little slower in the oncology ward, mostly, but the kids are always the hardest for her. My mom had cancer, Pepper told him. She had some beautiful nurses, and I still send them Christmas cards every year. I hope your aunt won't mind that we've stolen you for dinner. Pepper realized suddenly, her brow creasing faintly. May works Wednesday nights, Peter reassured her quickly. She won't be home until like 6 a.m. Pepper tilted her head slightly. So, what would you usually do for dinner Wednesday nights? She always leaves me either something to reheat or money for takeout, Peter explained. Pepper nodded and Tony was frowning. Peter ate every mouthful of his plate rather quickly, before Pepper could even offer him seconds. Tony took it upon himself to dump another serving of pie onto Peter's plate, and his own, so it was less conspicuous. Peter faltered briefly and said nothing before he started eating that helping too. When they'd finished eating, Peter looked up attentively. The moment Pepper rose to her feet and reached for their plates. Do you need any help, Miss Potts? Pepper ignored the exasperated look Tony shot the kid. She assumed more for the name than his offer to help clear the table. Tony nudged Peter lightly. Come on, kiddo. I'll take you home. Peter thanked Pepper twice for dinner before Tony managed to steer him towards the elevator. Spiderling, you do know that general rule is that once an adult says to call them by their first name, you can, right? You're literally encouraged to. He says it's not polite, Peter defended himself. Tony snorted. Well, I'm going to make it my personal mission to squash that out of you. Peter rolled his eyes as the elevator doors closed behind them. When Tony entered about an hour later, Pepper was curled up on the couch, flicking through a magazine. What do you think of making this weekly? Tony asked bluntly, collapsing onto the couch beside her. Pepper looked up in bewilderment. Peter coming over? Isn't that already weekly? She asked. Tony shook his head. No, not that. Dinner. Pepper's lips curved into a smile. You want Pepper to stay for dinner after his internship? Tony shrugged, avoiding her gaze. He's already here. Beats eating alone in an empty apartment, right? You're worried he's lonely? Pepper questioned, her brow creasing faintly. Tony hesitated, then shook his head. Forget it. It's dumb. No, Pepper cut him off firmly. It's not dumb. What is this song? Oh well. No, Pepper cut him off firmly. It's not dumb. Of course we can have Peter for dinner on Wednesdays if he wants to stay. Tony snorted lightly. Even if he wants to, he won't say it. Pepper sighed faintly. Yes, I noticed that too. He's so worried about wearing out his welcome, Tony complained, slightly pained. Like I'm going to get tired of him and toss him out? Am I that much of an asshole? Pepper I'm gonna start tweaking, I swear to God. Pepper closed her magazine and tossed it aside, reaching for his arm. Tony, no. Tony squeezed his eyes shut, pinching the bridge of his nose. I'm really trying here, Pep. Tony, honey, you're great with Peter. She reassured. Really, but you're still Iron Man. That's not going to just go away for Peter immediately. But the more time you spend with him, the more comfortable he's going to be, she promised. Where am I in this? Where is it? Tony glanced over at her before averting his eyes again and fiddling with a throw pillow on the couch. So I didn't screw everything up? He asked, a note of hope in his tone that wrenched at Pepper's heart. No, she promised. I bet Peter's already a lot more relaxed than he was the first week he came here, isn't he? Yeah. See, it takes time, Pepper smiled. Tony nodded faintly. Why don't we invite Peter and his aunt over for dinner this weekend? Pepper suggested. I'd like to meet May, and we can talk about Peter staying for dinner on Wednesdays then. Tony considered that. Yeah, all right, he agreed. I'll call May tomorrow and find out when she's working. Pepper couldn't help but smile at him. He's a good kid. He's a great kid, Tony corrected her. God knows why he's hanging around me, he sighed. Pepper wanted to immediately reassure him that Peter obviously looked up to him, and Tony wasn't as undeserving of Peter's company as he thought. But like with Peter, that would all take time. So instead, she smiled and squeezed his arm lightly. I think if Doc Brown and Marty McFly can make a friendship work, you and Peter will be okay, she said teasingly, and Tony snorted. Okay, that's the end of the first chapter. Thank you for watching. As always, the music in the video is not mine at all. I did not write this story, and me nor the author of this story own any rights to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Have a wonderful rest of your day.